The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade through flesh. Staff Sergeant Martinez pressed his ear closer to the receiver, but the transmission dissolved into white noise before he could make sense of it. Above the forward operating base, stars flickered through wisps of desert dust, and somewhere in that vast emptiness, an aircraft was supposed to be providing close air support for a SEAL team that had gone dark 3 hours ago. Control, this is Overlord 6. Still no contact with Neptune 4-1. Last known position grid 779er426. How copy? The response came back weak, distorted by atmospheric interference. Overlord 6, Control, air assets are negative, fuel state critical, RTB in 05 mics. Martinez felt his stomach drop. Return to base. The A-10 Thunderbolt that had been circling the target area was being recalled, leaving 12 Navy SEALs stranded somewhere in the Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan. Intel suggested they were pinned down by insurgent forces in a valley that had swallowed radio signals like a black hole swallows light. The operations center hummed with the controlled chaos of a mission going sideways. Banks of monitors displayed infrared imagery from distant drones, their heat signatures painting ghostly white shapes against the cold mountain terrain. But thermal imaging couldn't penetrate the limestone caves where the enemy was known to hide, couldn't reveal the fate of men who had volunteered for a raid that should have been routine. Captain Rebecca Viper Kellerman stood in the shadows near the coffee station, watching the tactical display with eyes that had seen too much. At 34, she was older than most attack pilots, her face bearing the weathered marks of someone who had flown combat missions when half the junior officers were still in high school. Her flight suit hung loose on her small frame, and the younger airmen often mistook her for ground crew until they noticed the silver wings pinned above her left breast pocket. "Ma'am," Martinez approached hesitantly, "you heard about Neptune 4-1." Kellerman nodded, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. She had been scheduled for the next rotation, her A-10 Warthog sitting on the tarmac fully armed and fueled. But regulations were regulations, and she was officially off duty for another 6 hours due to mandatory crew rest requirements. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Outside, the sound of jet engines spooling down echoed across the airfield as the last close air support aircraft touched down, its pilot probably already mentally composing the mission debrief that would explain why 12 American warriors had been abandoned to the darkness of an Afghan valley. Kellerman's radio, clipped to her belt, remained stubbornly silent. Dawn was still 3 hours away, and somewhere in those mountains, good men were counting ammunition and watching shadows for movement that might mean the difference between coming home and becoming another line in a casualty report. The brass would call it acceptable losses, the price of doing business in a war zone where split-second decisions carried the weight of lives. But Rebecca Kellerman had never learned to accept the acceptable. Her fingers drummed against her coffee cup, a nervous habit she developed during her first deployment to Iraq when she was still Lieutenant Kellerman, still trying to prove that a woman could fly the Warthog as well as any man. That was before Ramadi, before the incident that earned her the call sign Viper and cost her nearly everything she thought she wanted from her military career. The tactical radio erupted again. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. Neptune 4-1 taking heavy fire from multiple positions. We are combat ineffective and need immediate extraction. Grid 779er428, elevation 4,000 meters. We have wounded and are running low on ammunition." The transmission cut to static, but not before everyone in the operations center heard what they feared most: desperation bleeding through professional military composure. Somewhere in those mountains, America's elite warriors were fighting for their lives with diminishing hope and no air support coming to save them. Colonel Harrison burst through the operations center door, his uniform wrinkled from being hastily thrown on over his sleeping clothes. "Status report. Where's my air support?" "Sir, last hog just landed, Pilot reports bingo fuel, weapons expended. Next scheduled rotation isn't for. I don't want to hear about schedules. Harrison's voice carried the sharp edge of a career officer who had climbed ranks by never accepting excuses. I want options. Now. Martinez glanced at Kellerman, who had moved closer to the main tactical display. The infrared feed showed heat blooms scattered across the valley floor, muzzle flashes from automatic weapons creating brief white stars against the cold landscape. The SEALs were there, somewhere in that electronic constellation of violence, probably pressed against rocks that wouldn't stop bullets but might stop thermal imaging. "Sir," Martinez said carefully, "Captain Kellerman is here. She's rated on the Warthog and her aircraft is fueled and armed." Harrison's eyes found Kellerman in the dim light of the operations center. She stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, waiting for the inevitable objection that would keep her on the ground while better men died in the mountains. "Kellerman," Harrison's voice carried years of shared military history, most of it unpleasant. "Your outside crew rest minimums." "Yes, sir. Regulations clearly state. 12 men are going to die, Colonel." Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, carrying no hint of insubordination despite the words themselves. "The nearest air support is 4 hours out from Bagram. They don't have 4 hours." The operations center had gone quiet except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of generators. Every eye was on the colonel, waiting for a decision that would either save lives or end careers, possibly both. Harrison stared at the tactical display where white heat signatures flickered like dying stars. The SEAL team's position was deteriorating by the minute, compressed into an ever-smaller defensive perimeter as insurgent forces closed in from 3 sides. The valley walls created a natural funnel that would become a killing field once the enemy achieved decisive positioning. "The Pentagon will have my ass if something goes wrong," Harrison muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Kellerman stepped forward slightly, just enough to enter his peripheral vision. "With respect, sir, they'll have more than your ass if we leave Neptune for one out there." The colonel's laugh held no humor. "Viper, you've got exactly 1 flight left in you before the review board grounds you permanently. You sure you want to spend it on this?" The nickname hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Everyone in the operations center knew the story, or thought they did. Captain Rebecca Kellerman, call sign Viper, the pilot who had disobeyed direct orders during the Battle of Ramadi to provide close air support for a pinned-down infantry company. She had saved 43 American lives that day and earned a Distinguished Flying Cross. She had also been quietly blacklisted for insubordination, her career trajectory permanently altered by a single decision to prioritize soldiers over regulations. "Those men didn't choose to be there," Kellerman said quietly, "but I'm choosing to be here." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. In the culture of military aviation, where split-second decisions separated heroes from casualties, choice was everything. The SEALs had chosen to volunteer for a dangerous mission. Kellerman was choosing to volunteer for a dangerous rescue. Harrison looked at her for a long moment, seeing something in her eyes that reminded him why he had once recommended her for promotion before politics and protocol intervened. Behind the weathered exterior and the cautious demeanor was the same fierce determination that had made her legendary among ground forces and controversial among staff officers. Martinez prepped Captain Kellerman's aircraft for immediate launch, full weapons load, maximum fuel. Harrison turned back to Kellerman, his voice dropping to a tone that only she could hear. "Bring them home, Viper, all of them." "Yes, sir." The briefing was conducted while Kellerman suited up, pulling on flight gear that felt like a second skin after years of wearing it in combat zones across 3 continents. The mission parameters were grimly simple. Locate Neptune 4-1 in a valley that had become a communications dead zone, provide close air support against unknown enemy strength, and extract 12 SEALs before they became casualties. Her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Williams, ran through the weapons systems check with practiced efficiency. The A-10's nose-mounted GAU-8 Avenger cannon held 1,174 rounds of 30 depleted uranium ammunition, each round capable of punching through armored vehicles. Under the wings hung a mixed load of Maverick missiles and precision-guided bombs, enough firepower to level a city block. "Birds ready, Captain," Williams reported, his voice betraying none of the concern that creased his face. He had worked with Kellerman through 2 deployments, had seen her bring damaged aircraft home when other pilots would have ejected. "Weather's clear, winds light and variable." Kellerman performed her own pre-flight inspection, running her hands along control surfaces and checking weapon mounts, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that mechanical failure at the wrong moment meant death for everyone involved. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was an ugly aircraft, built for function over form, its massive engines mounted high to avoid ingesting debris during low-level attack runs. But to Kellerman, it was beautiful in its brutal simplicity. She climbed into the cockpit as the eastern horizon began to show the faintest hint of gray. The familiar ritual of starting the engines, running system checks, and establishing radio contact provided a counterpoint to the adrenaline building in her chest. This was what she had trained for, what she was born to do. Tower, Viper 1-1 ready for departure. Viper 1-1 Tower, clear for immediate takeoff, runway 27, good hunting. The A-10's twin General Electric TF-34 engines spun up with a distinctive whine that had become synonymous with salvation for American ground forces throughout the war. Kellerman released the brakes and felt 37,000 pounds of armored aircraft begin to roll forward, gathering speed, until the moment when physics and engineering achieved that ancient miracle of human flight. As the landing gear retracted with solid metallic thumps, Kellerman banked north toward the mountains where 12 men waited for someone to answer their prayers. Below, the forward operating base shrank to a collection of lights against the desert floor, and ahead lay a darkness that would test everything she had learned about war, honor, and the price of doing what was right instead of what was ordered. The radio remained silent as she climbed to cruising altitude, but she knew that somewhere in those mountains, men were fighting for their lives with weapons that grew lighter with each passing minute. Time was not on their side, and neither was the terrain that funneled sound waves away from their radios and provided natural cover for an enemy that knew every cave and fighting position. At 23,000 feet, Kellerman leveled off and pushed the throttles forward, chasing Dawn toward a rendezvous with fate that would either cement her reputation as one of the finest close air support pilots in the Air Force or end her career in a court-martial proceeding. The A-10 responded with the steady acceleration of an aircraft designed for exactly this kind of mission, flying into harm's way to protect American warriors who couldn't protect themselves. Her hands were steady on the controls, but her mind drifted briefly to the last letter she had written to her sister, sealed and locked in her footlocker back at base. It began with the words, "If you're reading this," and continued with explanations that felt inadequate for choices that couldn't be explained to people who had never worn a uniform or felt the weight of other lives depending on decisions made in milliseconds. The mountains rose ahead like sleeping giants, their peaks touched with snow that would be brilliant white in full daylight, but now appeared as pale suggestions against the pre-dawn sky. Somewhere in those mountains, Neptune 4-1 was making its last stand, and Captain Rebecca Viper Kellerman was flying alone into a situation that would test every lesson she had learned about combat, courage, and the unwritten code that bound warriors together across all branches of service. The radio crackled again. Any station, this is Neptune 4-1. We are in contact with approximately 40 enemy fighters. Request immediate close air support. We are danger close to enemy positions and cannot mark our location without compromising concealment. Kellerman keyed her microphone. Neptune 4-1, Viper 1-1 inbound your position. I'll be overhead in 12 minutes. Keep your heads down. The response came back immediately, relief audible even through the static. Viper 1-1, Neptune 4-1. Outstanding. We'll pop smoke when you're ready to make your runs. 12 minutes to save 12 lives. Kellerman pushed the throttles to military power and began her descent toward the valley where everything would be decided in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Behind her, the forward operating base was already coordinating search and rescue assets, but everyone understood that rescue would be meaningless if there was no one left to save by the time helicopters could reach the contact area. The A-10 Warthog was officially designated as a close air support aircraft, but Kellerman knew it was something more elemental than that. It was retribution with wings, hope delivered at the speed of sound, the physical manifestation of America's promise to never leave its warriors behind. She had made that promise every time she strapped into the cockpit, and today she would either keep it or die trying. The valley opened before her like a wound in the Earth's surface, dark and jagged, and holding secrets that would soon be revealed by 30 cannon fire and precision-guided munitions. Kellerman could feel her pulse steady, her breathing regulate, her mind entering the crystal clarity that came with approaching combat. This was what she had been trained for, what every simulator flight and weapons school exercise had prepared her to do. But training was theory, and war was practice, and the difference between them was measured in the weight of choices that could never be undone. As the first enemy muzzle flashes appeared like fireflies in the valley below, Captain Rebecca Kellerman, call sign Viper, began her descent into a battle that would either vindicate every controversial decision of her military career or add her name to the list of pilots who had pushed too hard and paid the ultimate price. The hunt was about to begin, and in the pre-dawn darkness of Afghanistan, predators would be separated from prey by reflexes, training, and the kind of courage that couldn't be taught in any school or manual. Kellerman checked her weapons systems one final time and prepared to find out which category she belonged in. The mountains below held their secrets closely, but they were about to give up at least one. Whether 12 Navy SEALs would live to see another sunrise, and whether an A-10 pilot with a controversial past would be the one to ensure they did. The first rays of dawn touched the peaks as Kellerman began her attack run, and somewhere in the valley below, the sound of salvation approached on twin turbojet engines that had been designed to bring American warriors home. Through her heads-up display, thermal signatures began to resolve into human shapes scattered across the rocky terrain. The enemy had chosen their ground well, positioning themselves on elevated terrain that provided overlapping fields of fire into the natural depression where the SEALs had taken cover. But they had made one critical error. They had assumed air support was gone for good. Kellerman activated her targeting systems and prepared to show them exactly how wrong that assumption was. The hunt had begun, and Viper was airborne. The radio frequency, designated for close air support missions, remained silent as Kellerman approached the contact area, her aircraft's radar warning receiver scanning for surface-to-air missile threats that could turn her rescue mission into a suicide run. Intelligence reports suggested the enemy possessed man-portable air defense systems, shoulder-fired missiles that could reach up to 15,000 feet and turn an A-10 into a falling meteor of twisted metal and burning fuel. She descended to 8,000 feet, low enough to identify targets but high enough to maintain some standoff distance from small arms fire. The valley spread below her like a three-dimensional chessboard where every rock could hide a rifleman and every shadow might conceal an anti-aircraft team. The SEALs were somewhere in that maze of stone and scrub vegetation, probably pressed against whatever cover they could find while enemy fighters closed in from multiple directions. Neptune 4-1, Viper 1-1 overhead. I need you to mark your position with infrared strobes. I'm going to make a show of force pass to see what we're dealing with. The response crackled through her headset. Viper 1-1, Neptune 4-1. Negative on the strobes. We're surrounded and cannot risk revealing our position. Enemy is approximately 50 meters from our perimeter on 3 sides. 50 meters. In military terms, that was danger close, the kind of proximity that made precision airstrikes a delicate balance between destroying the enemy and killing the people you were trying to save. 1 degree of error in targeting, 1 gust of wind affecting ordnance trajectory, and friendly fire would accomplish what the insurgents couldn't. Kellerman banked left and began a wide orbit of the valley, using her targeting pod to scan the terrain for heat signatures and movement patterns that would reveal enemy positions. The thermal imaging painted a confusing picture of scattered hot spots that could be human beings or sun-warmed rocks, potential threats, or false alarms that could waste precious ammunition on geological formations. Neptune 4-1. I'm painting multiple heat signatures but need confirmation before I can engage. Can you give me a direction to your immediate threat? Viper 1-1. Primary threat is northeast of our position, approximately 60 meters. Secondary threats east and southeast, various ranges. We count at least 40 enemy fighters, possibly more in the caves. 40 fighters with high ground advantage and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The SEALs were outnumbered more than 3-1, pinned down in terrain that offered minimal cover and no escape routes. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a job for multiple aircraft working in coordination, with attack helicopters providing precise fire support while fixed-wing aircraft dealt with larger concentrations of enemy forces. But circumstances were anything but normal, and Kellerman was flying alone into a situation that doctrine said required overwhelming air superiority. She adjusted her orbit to approach from the south, using the rising sun to silhouette enemy positions while keeping her own aircraft in shadow for as long as possible. The first anti-aircraft fire appeared as green tracers rising from a ridgeline to her left, 23 rounds that passed several hundred meters behind her aircraft, as enemy gunners struggled to lead a target moving at 300 knots. Kellerman noted the muzzle flash location and continued her orbit, building a mental picture of enemy positions while staying outside the effective range of their heaviest weapons. More tracers reached toward her aircraft, creating deadly geometric patterns against the morning sky. The enemy had revealed at least 4 anti-aircraft positions, which meant they had been planning for air attacks and had positioned themselves accordingly. This wasn't a hasty ambush by opportunistic insurgents. It was a well-coordinated trap designed to capture or kill American Special Operations Forces. Neptune 4-1, Viper 1-1. I count 4 AAA positions and estimate enemy strength at 40 to 50 fighters. I'm going to suppress the anti-aircraft guns first, then work on the infantry positions. Stay down and get ready to move when I tell you. Roger, Viper, will be ready, and thanks for coming back. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Everyone on that radio frequency understood that Kellerman was supposed to be in her bunk, that regulations and common sense both argued against a single aircraft engaging such overwhelming enemy strength. But warriors recognized other warriors, and the SEAL team leader's voice carried the gratitude of men who had accepted they might die in those mountains, until an A-10 pilot decided that acceptable losses were not acceptable after all. Kellerman rolled, inverted, and pulled the nose down into a 30-degree dive, her targeting system locking onto the northernmost anti-aircraft position. The GAU-8 cannon was designed to destroy Soviet tanks, and insurgent fighting positions would offer no meaningful resistance to depleted uranium rounds traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Neptune 4-1, Viper 1-1 is in hot. Guns, guns, guns. The A-10 shuddered as the 7-barrel Gatling gun spun up to firing speed, spitting tungsten core projectiles at a rate of 65 rounds per second. The sound was distinctive, a mechanical roar that ground forces had learned to associate with salvation and enemy fighters had learned to fear above all other weapons of war. Her first target disappeared in a cloud of pulverized rock and flying debris, the anti-aircraft gun silenced permanently along with its crew. Kellerman pulled up hard, feeling G-forces press her into her ejection seat as she climbed back to altitude for another attack run. 3 more anti-aircraft positions remained active, their green tracers now converging on her aircraft with improved accuracy as gunners adjusted their aim. A proximity alarm chimed in her headset as a surface-to-air missile launched from a concealed position, its heat-seeking warhead automatically tracking the infrared signature of her engines. Kellerman deployed chaff and flares while pulling into a hard left turn, feeling the A-10's armored cockpit protect her from G-forces that would have rendered most pilots unconscious. The missile passed 50 meters behind her aircraft, confused by the infrared countermeasures and unable to reacquire its target. But more missiles were surely being prepared, and her window of opportunity was closing with each passing second as enemy forces adapted to her presence. She rolled into another attack run, this time targeting the eastern anti-aircraft position that posed the greatest threat to any extraction helicopters that might be dispatched to collect the SEAL team. The GAU-8 spoke again, its mechanical voice delivering a message of destruction that silenced another enemy gun position and opened a corridor of relatively safe airspace above the valley floor. Neptune 4-1, you've got movement to your northwest. Approximately 20 enemy fighters attempting to flank your position. I'm engaging now. The tactical situation was becoming clearer as Kellerman maintained her orbit and systematically eliminated threats. The SEALs were positioned in a natural depression that provided cover from direct fire, but also trapped them in a position with limited escape routes. Enemy forces were attempting to surround them completely, using the broken terrain to approach under cover while maintaining suppressive fire from elevated positions. It was a textbook insurgent tactic, designed to pin down superior forces until numerical advantage could be brought to bear. But the insurgents had planned for conventional air support response times and hadn't accounted for a single A-10 pilot willing to violate crew rest regulations to provide immediate assistance. Kellerman selected a Maverick missile and locked onto a cluster of heat signatures moving across open ground toward the SEAL position. The missile guided true, its 125-pound warhead detonating among the advancing fighters and eliminating the flanking threat before it could develop into something more dangerous. Good hit, Viper. That broke up their assault. We're still taking fire from the ridgeline to our north. The northern ridge was the key terrain feature, a rocky spine that dominated the valley floor and provided commanding views of all approaches. Enemy fighters positioned there could observe and direct fire against any attempted rescue, while remaining relatively safe from ground-based retaliation. Taking that ridge would require precision strikes that could neutralize threats without triggering rock slides that might bury the SEALs in their defensive positions. Kellerman consulted her mission computer, calculating angles and blast effects for strikes that would need to be measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. The margin for error was essentially zero, and the consequences of miscalculation would be catastrophic for everyone involved. She armed another Maverick and began her approach, knowing that this attack would either break the enemy's hold on the valley or provide them with the wreckage of an American attack aircraft to display as a propaganda victory. The choice had been made when she decided to take off despite regulations, and now physics and training would determine the outcome. The missile streaked toward the ridge as Kellerman pulled up and turned to observe the results of her attack. The warhead detonated precisely where she had aimed, carving a crater in the rock face and silencing the enemy positions that had been directing fire against the trapped SEALs. But victory was measured in seconds rather than minutes, and already she could see new heat signatures moving into positions vacated by the dead. The enemy had depth to their defensive positions, backup fighters ready to replace casualties and continue the siege that would eventually overwhelm the isolated SEAL team through simple attrition. Neptune 4-1, I've neutralized the primary threat positions, but you're still taking fire from secondary locations. I need you to be ready to move when I create an opening. What's your casualty status? Viper 1-1, we have 2 wounded, 1 urgent. We can move, but we'll need assistance getting our casualties to an extraction point. 2 wounded, 1 urgent. That meant at least 1 SEAL was seriously injured, possibly unable to move under his own power. Any extraction would need to account for men who couldn't run or fight effectively, which would slow the entire team and make them vulnerable during movement to a landing zone. Kellerman checked her fuel state and ammunition count. She had enough JP-8 for another 30 minutes of combat operations, and her weapons load was approximately 60% depleted. Time was becoming as much of an enemy as the insurgent fighters scattered throughout the valley. Control, Viper 1-1. I need immediate coordination for CASEVAC assets to Grid 779-428. Neptune 4-1 has wounded requiring urgent medical attention. The response from the operations center carried the controlled stress of personnel coordinating multiple moving pieces. Viper 1-1, Control. CASEVAC launch will require suppression of all anti-aircraft threats in the immediate area. Can you guarantee a sterile environment for helicopter operations? Guarantee. In military aviation, guarantees were promises written in blood, commitments that could cost lives if they proved inaccurate. Kellerman looked down at the valley where enemy fighters continued to maneuver despite her attacks, regrouping and adapting with the tactical flexibility of experienced guerrilla warriors. Control, I can guarantee it for 30 minutes. After that, we'll need additional air support or the window closes. 30 minutes to eliminate all remaining threats, clear a landing zone, and provide security for helicopters that would be vulnerable during the time required to load wounded personnel. It was an ambitious timeline under ideal circumstances, and circumstances were far from ideal. Kellerman rolled into another attack run, this time targeting a cluster of fighters who had taken position in a cave mouth that provided natural protection from air attacks. The precision-guided bomb she selected was designed for exactly this kind of target, its penetrating warhead capable of collapsing cave systems and eliminating threats that conventional ordnance couldn't reach. The explosion sent a column of smoke and debris into the morning air, and secondary explosions suggested the cave had been used to store ammunition or other explosive materials. Another threat eliminated, but Kellerman could see more movement throughout the valley as enemy forces continued to reposition and adapt to her presence. Her aircraft shuddered as small arms fire found its mark, bullets striking the A-10's armored skin without penetrating to vital systems. The Warthog had been designed to absorb battle damage and continue flying, its redundant control systems and armored cockpit providing protection that lighter aircraft couldn't match. But even the A-10 had limits, and sustained fire from multiple positions could eventually find a vulnerable spot. Viper 1-1, you're taking hits, came the call from Neptune 4-1. We can see tracers converging on your position. Copy that. I'm combat effective and continuing the mission. Combat effective. The phrase carried professional understatement that concealed the reality of flying a damaged aircraft into continuing enemy fire while trying to provide precision strikes in support of friendly forces. Kellerman ran through her damage assessment procedures, checking hydraulic pressure, engine parameters, and flight control response while maintaining her attack profile. Everything appeared within normal limits, but she could feel a slight vibration in the control stick that suggested minor damage to one of the flight control surfaces. Not enough to abort the mission, but enough to remind her that the enemy was shooting back with intent to kill rather than merely harass her aircraft. She selected her last Maverick missile and targeted what appeared to be a command position on the eastern ridge, a location where several groups of fighters had been observed converging during her previous attacks. Leaders were high-value targets, and eliminating enemy command and control could disrupt coordination between dispersed fighting positions. The missile impact created another pillar of smoke and flying debris, and this time Kellerman could observe enemy fighters breaking cover and running away from their positions, rather than maintaining defensive discipline. The psychological effect of precision airstrikes was often as important as their physical destruction, creating panic and confusion that could break up coordinated attacks. Neptune 4-1, enemy forces are beginning to withdraw from your immediate area. I'm going to hit them while they're moving. Get ready to displace to extraction point on my mark. Roger, Viper, will be ready to move. Kellerman inverted her aircraft and dove toward the valley floor, bringing the GAU-8 cannon to bear on enemy fighters who had abandoned their concealed positions in favor of retreat. The 30 rounds impacted among the fleeing insurgents like hammers striking anvils, each impact throwing up geysers of pulverized rock and organic matter. She pulled up from her strafing run and immediately rolled into another attack, this time focusing on a group of fighters who were attempting to establish a new defensive position farther up the valley. The cannon fire walked across their location with mechanical precision, eliminating the threat before it could organize into something more dangerous. Neptune 4-1, this is Viper 1-1. I've suppressed enemy forces in your immediate area. Time to move. Head southeast toward grid 779-430. That's your extraction point. Moving now, Viper. Neptune 4-1 is displacing with 2 wounded. From her vantage point at 7,000 feet, Kellerman could observe the SEAL team's movement as tiny heat signatures against the cooler ground. They moved with the tactical discipline of elite warriors, bounding between covered positions while maintaining security in all directions. But their pace was slowed by wounded teammates, and every second of exposure increased their vulnerability to any enemy fighters who might still be operational in the area. She maintained her orbit above the extraction point, scanning for threats while monitoring fuel state and ammunition count. The GAU-8 cannon still held several hundred rounds, enough for additional strafing runs if required, but her missile inventory was depleted, and she was approaching the point where fuel limitations would force a return to base regardless of the tactical situation on the ground. Control, Viper 1-1. Neptune 4-1 is moving to extraction point. I need those CASEVAC birds inbound now. My fuel state will require RTB in 20 minutes. Viper 1-1 Control. CASEVAC launch in progress. ETA to your location 15 minutes. Can you maintain overwatch until handoff? 15 minutes until rescue helicopters arrived. 20 minutes until fuel exhaustion forced her departure. The timeline was workable, but barely, and any complications could transform a successful rescue into a disaster that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their careers. Kellerman checked her navigation display and confirmed the extraction point grid coordinates. The location was a relatively flat area near the valley mouth, large enough for helicopter operations, but surrounded by elevated terrain that could shelter surviving enemy forces. It would be defensible for a short period, but not indefinitely, especially if additional insurgent reinforcements were moving toward the sound of battle. Through her thermal imaging system, she could observe the SEAL team's progress as they bounded across open ground between covered positions. Their movement was professional and coordinated, but she could see that they were indeed carrying wounded teammates, which slowed their displacement and created additional tactical challenges. Viper 1-1, Neptune 4-1. We're 200 meters from the extraction point, taking sporadic fire from unknown positions to our north. Can you investigate? Kellerman adjusted her orbit to scan the northern approaches to the extraction site. Her thermal sensors detected multiple heat signatures moving through broken terrain, enemy fighters who had survived her previous attacks and were attempting to re-establish contact with the withdrawing SEAL team. She rolled into an attack run without hesitation, bringing the GAU-8 to bear on the pursuing enemy forces. The cannon fire impacted among the rocks like a mechanical thunderstorm, 30 rounds shattering stone and flesh with equal efficiency. Several heat signatures disappeared from her thermal display, but others continued moving toward positions that would allow them to engage the seals during the vulnerable extraction process. Neptune 4-1, Viper 1-1. I'm engaging pursuing forces, but some are still mobile. You need to get to that extraction point now. Copy Viper, Neptune 4-1 is moving. The next few minutes passed in a blur of tactical decisions made at the speed of thought. Kellerman maintained continuous attacks against enemy forces, while simultaneously coordinating with incoming CASEVAC helicopters and monitoring the SEAL team's movement to the extraction site. Each attack run required split-second timing to avoid friendly fire incidents, and each pull-up exposed her aircraft to ground fire from positions she hadn't yet identified. Her aircraft took more hits, small arms fire that punched through non-critical systems without affecting flight operations. Warning lights flickered on her instrument panel, indicating minor damage to secondary systems, but the A-10's robust design allowed her to continue fighting despite battle damage that would have forced other aircraft to withdraw. Viper 1-1, Thunder 2-1 flight inbound your position for CASEVAC operations. Request immediate area sanitization for safe helicopter operations. The rescue helicopters were approaching, their crews depending on Kellerman's ability to suppress enemy fire during the vulnerable period when aircraft would be stationary on the ground. Helicopter extractions were complex operations requiring coordination between multiple aircraft types, each with different capabilities and limitations that had to be balanced against enemy capabilities and intentions. Thunder 2-1, Viper 1-1. Area is mostly suppressed but still taking sporadic fire from unknown positions. Recommend fast rope extraction rather than landing. Negative Viper. We have urgent surgical casualties that require immediate medical attention. We need to land. Urgent surgical casualties. That meant one of the wounded SEALs was critically injured, possibly dying, requiring the kind of medical intervention that could only be provided in a stable helicopter rather than during a fast rope extraction. The rescue helicopters would have to land and remain vulnerable while medical personnel worked to stabilize the casualty for transport. Kellerman acknowledged the transmission and began what would be her final series of attack runs, systematically engaging every suspected enemy position within 2 kilometers of the extraction site. She had enough ammunition for perhaps 5 more gun runs, after which the helicopters would be dependent on their own defensive systems and whatever covering fire the SEAL team could provide. The valley floor erupted in explosions and flying debris as her attacks walked across enemy positions with methodical precision. Some targets proved to be false alarms, rocks heated by morning sunlight that appeared on thermal imaging as potential threats. Others revealed themselves to be genuine fighting positions when secondary explosions.